Chapter 1. You are listening at Novel Full. Audio. The sun shone high in the sky, illuminating the clear blue waters that yielded to a massive silver yacht. Noble families exchanged pleasantries as they approached an unimaginably large crescent-shaped island. The captain stood stoically at the helm of the ship. Clothed in formal navy attire, his uniform was a crisp scene of whites, blacks, and golds. His right-hand man and friend of many years stood respectfully by his side, looking out at the opening gates that connected the ends of the island. "Looks like another successful trip to Focus Academy, Captain." The captain, being a man of few words, simply grunted. Back within the levels of the yacht, the fa.ade of politeness was slowly fading as the heavy atmosphere of competition solidified in the air. "I have the utmost confidence in my son," spoke a towering man who easily stood past 2 meters tall. A short Asian man stood with hands clasped behind his back chuckling. "Your Storm family sure seems to have a lot of backbone when you aren't hiding with your tail between your legs." Nearby, a beautiful dark-skinned lady with sharp silver eyes slowly tilted a glass of sparkling wine to her full lips before saying, "That reminds me, how is the Ragnar family doing?" "You." The towering man seemed to almost lose his temper before slowly reining himself in. To the surprise of those around him, he instead smiled and stroked his well-kept beard. "I guess all these years of teasing has finally made you grow numb to it." Storm." A handsome man strolled into the group of nobles, wearing a bewitching smile and hiding shining golden eyes behind crystal-framed glasses. "Ah, sapientia. Not at all. It's just that this year's round of opening ceremony performances will end with my Storm family receiving the highest glory. This should be disputed among the younger generation. After all, it won't be us going up there." "You may be right, but I'll smile from the sidelines nonetheless. We'll soon see who among the new batch is most talented." The tall man turned back to the elegant lady and short Asian man before plastering a smug smile on his masculine features. "From what I hear, our children might not even stand a chance. Delia of the Pasha, Neva family and Mayumi of the Kami family are said to be well past their years." The lady took yet another sip of wine. The Asian man shot a glance over. "I didn't know that the Duco family was so fond of giving up before putting up a fight." A light laughter filled the floor. "Don't mistake my intentions, bye. I've simply been suppressing information on my little fire spark. You should all warn your children to not be arrogant. Usually, it's only the founding families of the school who participate in this event. However, remember that a commoner actually passed the test this year," the handsome man spoke before allowing his voice to trail off. The silence of palpable. Their apprehension was understandable. As an appeasement to the mortal governments, the martial world issues a sort of bridge to allow students of common birth into their ranks. Over the centuries, this test has become more of a formality. Since no one ever passed, it was, instead, a sign of good faith that the two worlds could continue to coexist. "Do you think their bloodlines could be awakening?" Storm whispered in a hushed voice. "Don't be ridiculous. We already checked his background." With the sub-pres, Duco cut herself off, instead deciding to take another sip of wine. Sighing, the Asian man turned to leave before pausing for one final word. "This is the first time we've allowed a commoner to participate in the opening ceremonies. It may be surprising that he passed, but it's not as though the test was very difficult to begin with." After a small pause, he continued. "You all know very well that we didn't need to go so far as to allow him to participate in the opening ceremony. So, you all know very well why we displayed upon him this kindness. Don't overreach without cause and poke a bear we shouldn't." The nobles didn't have much to worry about. With no family backing, it would be impossible for this commoner to do much of anything. However, these nobles had lived for many years and had come to learn that variables could destroy even the most carefully laid out plans. If this child truly was a genius, one worthy of joining a side or even main branch of a noted family, he could tip the delicate balance of their martial world. Usually, they would simply use their overwhelming power to stop this boy from joining, or even falsify the test results. But, the testing process wasn't only overseen by them. Families from schools around the universe had access to the results. If they tampered, it would only raise the interest of those families to recruit the commoner behind their backs. Even just killing him wasn't an option because a war with the human world wasn't something they could divert their attention to. It wasn't as though the mortal world was filled with pushovers. In fact, the country this commoner came from was more than capable of posing a threat to them. In the end they decided to admit him to the school. After all, even if he was a genius now, without proper resources he could be easily stifled. The nobles dispersed, each unconsciously erasing the child from their minds. His 15 minutes of fame were up to them. Dark horse or not, a commoner could never compare to geniuses raised by their families. Oblivious to his impact, a lean light-skinned boy rocked in a small wooden boat attached by a line to the back of the massive silver yacht. He slowly awoke from his nap to find that he had glided through the gates along with the ship. He jumped up, almost forgetting where he was. Steadying himself, he looked around. His eyes were large, sparkling a light hazel before tapering into a light green to gray color. Given his age, his muscles weren't well developed, but they rippled with a youthful vigor that could only be gained through intensive training. That said, he was tall, being about 1.9 meters in height already despite being only 16 years old. His features had a certain immature and budding handsomeness to them. Considering his partial African origin, his hair curled on his head, only shifting slightly in the wind and shining in hints of brown, red and gold. But what threw the guards on the walls of the gate off the most, was the fact that, other than his twin wrist bands, he wore nothing else to cover himself. Who the hell is that kid? The guards were about to jump into action when they were stopped by their acting commander. Leave him be, the captain of that ship already informed us about him. He couldn't pay to be on the ship, so he followed behind. Is he from a branch family that lost the backing of their main branch? The guard who cried out asked. No. From what I hear, he's the first commoner they've allowed into Focus Academy. The surrounding guards were stunned. Being from branch families themselves, they were all too aware of how difficult it was to survive in that school without proper backing. But even they had some, regardless of how small it might be. To join the school with no family in the martial world. That was something they couldn't imagine doing. The boy continued to scan his surroundings before smiling a wide smile. He waved to the guards on the wall before jumping into the Crescent Island's inner lake. He jumped. Even the commander was stunned this time. This kid was just too much. It may seem like he had made it into the academy, but the area within the Crescent Moon Island still spanned hundreds of kilometers. If he left the lead of the silver yacht now, he wouldn't make it to the opening ceremony being held in a few days without help. The commander assumed that because the boy was attached to the back of the ship, he couldn't see the far distance that still needed to be traveled to reach the academy. The commander shook his head. It's better if he learns early of the large world he just stepped into. I hear that the nobles are actually letting him participate in the opening ceremony. It's obvious their intentions aren't pure. Don't help him. There are no life-ending dangers in the lake anyway. It's better if he misses out that sort of humiliation. With that, he walked away. The boy had not a care in the world. It had been a long trip, so he decided to clean himself up a bit and get in some exercise. In his mind, the distance to the center of the lake wasn't that far anyway. It should be about 300 kilometers from here to the center from the information I gathered. Should take about 4 days. The boy smiled a bright smile while reclining in the lake. He spun around and kicked himself into a freestyle swim. Let's see if I can do it in 3. What the commander didn't know is that the boy knew the distance and was quite confident in his ability to make it. However, what the boy hadn't counted on was the density of the water. When he began his swim, the boy frowned. This wasn't the first time he had swam a long distance, yet, this time felt completely different. This water. His confusion was warranted. For water to be as clear as this, it should mean that most of the life within it was gone. He could see hundreds of meters below the surface, and yet, instead of the lack of additional substances making it easier to swim, he found it exceedingly difficult. He dipped his tongue in the water. It's not salty. Although this body of water was usually called Crescent Lake, it wasn't cut off from the ocean outside. If the gates didn't have passageways for the water, they would be too difficult to open and cause a massive wave each time they were used. So, for this water to be so weighty, and yet not salty and still be devoid of life. It was definitely a mystery. By the boy's calculations he had 5 days to make it to the opening ceremony. The boy grinned, an arrogant disdain for the world flashing across his immature features. If it wasn't at least this difficult, your so-called Focus Academy wouldn't be worthy of Diane Sacharo. Chapter 2. You are listening at novelfull.audio. At dawn on the 5th day of his swim, Diane was greeted with a scene that made him forget the pain in his tired limbs. From about 10 kilometers away, he saw 3 risings of about 20 meters each, implanted directly into the water. They were covered in tiles of hexagonal stainless steel that reflected the orange hues of the early morning sun and topped with a combination of small villages and endless lush greenery. But what caught Diane's attention the most was the skyscraper that was even further ahead. It reached a height of at least 2,000 meters. Covered by endless glass, it had a dominatingly beautiful sheen to it. But what shocked Diane was the fact that each of the 3 risings were connected to each other by underwater passageways. Diane was stunned. Why are there passages underwater? He dived down and nearly took a breath. The 3 risings were actually 6. Further beyond the area where Diane had seen the skyscraper, were 3 more identical risings. The 6 formed a perfect hexagonal pattern around the base of the skyscraper. The reason why they were connected by underwater tunnels was because the risings weren't the end of them. While the tops of the risings had fields, forests, and small villages, they merely topped off impressive underwater structures. The 6 risings were actually miniature versions of the massive 2,000-meter skyscraper, just flipped upside down. They stretched at least 1,000 meters below the surface and were made up entirely of glass with stainless steel accents. Seems that these 6 skyscrapers are not only connected to each other, but also the skyscraper in the middle of them by these underwater passageways. The ceremony is probably held in the middle. Diane mused about whether you could really call an underwater building a skyscraper as he pushed himself forward. Knowing he had a few hours left, Diane decided to swim as fast as he could towards one of the risings that was mostly forest. He shook his head, chuckling to himself. After all, he couldn't very well step into a village with no clothes on, he would have to change first. I'll have to scale the 20-meter rising. Considering I could make out the shape of the tiles that made up the rising from this far away, it's safe to say that they're massive. That'll make climbing more difficult. Around noon, Diane sighed. Sometimes, he hated being right. He was just a half-meter from the top of the rising he had chosen. Because of the size of the tiles, he had to alternate between a weird spider crawl between the tiles and climbing up the incline of its sides. Diane reached up, flexed his back with all his remaining strength, and hoisted himself up. He jumped over the barrier and fell about 3 meters. Luckily, he was prepared for this and ducked off into a roll to ease the impact. Finally, Diane roared at the top of his burning lungs before dropping his hands to his knees and taking deep breaths. He was about to raise his head when he felt cold metal rest on his shoulder. For fuck's sake, Diane muttered to himself before even looking up. Explain or your head flies. The voice sounded so melodic that Diane almost couldn't take it seriously. However, Diane had more thoughts than that running through his head. He had already understood his situation. This girl sounded like she was about his age, yet she had a weapon capable of killing him from the looks of it. That probably means she goes to this school. Diane smiled, this would make finding his way much simpler. So, instead of answering, he flicked his wrist, calling upon a control panel, and selected a sleek black bag. Well, I could explain, or I could put my clothes on. Which do you prefer? Diane said while looking up. Without hesitation, the girl responded, expertly hiding the surprise she held at the device Diane just used. I prefer both. Diane was a bit surprised. It didn't usually take much to fluster teenage girls. He thought it would only be easier if he was naked, but this girl seemed different. It's not within me to disappoint such a pretty lady, Diane said while unzipping the bag. He slipped on his boxers and a crisp white shirt. He pulled up light blue jeans and rolled up the hems before slipping on a sky-blue dress shirt that he kept unbuttoned. While rolling up his sleeves, Diane finally got a good look at the girl holding a sword to his throat. He slipped on some black flip-flops while doing nothing to hide the glint of attraction in his eye. Before, he had called her a pretty lady just to try and fluster her, but now, if he said it again, he'd mean it. Her skin had a tan sheen to it that had to be of Hispanic origin. Diane couldn't figure out if her eyes were a pale green or a dim hazel, and that only served to transfix him even more. Her hair flowed in the wind well past her shoulders with a sense of a golden blonde permeating its light brown. Her lips were as full as her facial features. Everything about her was warm and inviting. Well, except for the killing blade in her hand. My guards will be here soon, considering how loudly you screamed. So, you have about 10 more seconds to convince me not to kill you. She spoke in a steady tone as if unbothered by the scene she had just witnessed. Diane was about to speak when the wind carried her scent to him. Kiwi and strawberries. Excellent choice. The girl raised her eyebrows, before realizing what he meant. She pressed the side of the sword more firmly into Diane's shoulder. Diane didn't seem to notice as he continued. I doubt you have guards coming, honestly. If you do, you should consider firing them. The girl sighed. Maybe so, but that's not going to stop me from killing you. Diane smiled. This girl really was quite intelligent. Instead of denying it, she played an even stronger card. She already understood that anyone of minimal intelligence would be able to tell that any type of guard should have long been present. Since you've piqued my interest, I'll tell you. I'm a student here. In fact, the entrance ceremony should be soon. Could I bother you to take me there? What kind of joke is that? Piqued your interest. You're clearly just trying to use me to get where you need to go. Now answer my questions. Where did you come from? And why did you enter through the fence instead of the normal passageways? I actually arrived by the silver yacht. Well, I arrived by small dinghy attached to a silver yacht. Unfortunately, they didn't accept commoner paper, and since I didn't have any energy stones, I couldn't afford the ride. But, I left them by the gates and decided to swim here instead. Ridiculous, there's a 300 kilometers distance from here to the gates. And these waters aren't something just anyone can swim through. Especially not for a first-year student like you. Now I'll ask again, and for the last time, where did you come from? And how did you get in through the fence? Diane, having finally caught his breath, took another deep one before standing to his full height. Ignoring the sword pressed to his shoulder and up against his throat, he spoke. I'm actually quite interested in that. Why was the water so heavy? It took me a full 5 days to get here. I'm exhausted. You must be tired of living. The girl said with her eyes narrowing. Listen. I know it isn't exactly a great vote of confidence for our first meeting to start with you seeing me in all my glory, but tell me the truth, Diane said, leaning in ever so slightly. Am I adequate? The girl rolled her eyes. How shameless was this guy? She had already decided he wasn't a threat despite being a full head shorter, so she retracted her sword and put it into its sheath. She swept her hands over her white training uniform and removed a hairband from her wrist to tie up her hair. Seeing her actions, Diane took a bit of time to take in his surroundings. They stood in a rare clearing of land at the edge of a dense forest. The grass seemed to be pressed down and broken, with even some portions being ripped up entirely. She must use this area to train. Considering the marks, it's best not to provoke this beauty too much. Diane said while smiling to himself. I'm Diane, it's nice to meet you. What family do you come from? I assume you're a member of one of the smaller branches since I've never seen you. She decided to ignore his entrance and the fact he said he swam here. In her mind, if Diane was telling the truth, it probably had something to do with that weird device on his wrist. In the martial arts world, they had interspatial products in a myriad of forms, however, they all relied on energy and senses. But when Diane used his, she felt no fluctuations. In fact, it was just like any other piece of technology. Sacharo. Sakaro. I've never heard of it. But then she gasped and looked at Diane more deeply than she had before. Is something wrong? Diane said with his usual casual smile. So, you're the commoner they allowed in. My father told me about you. She said absent-mindedly. Diane laughed. Commoner. If he was back on the mortal world, who didn't look up to him in awe? Never in his life had he been called anything remotely close to common. The girl said nothing as she continued to look at Diane. May I ask for your name, milady? It would be a high honor for a commoner such as myself. Delia. Delia Patia, Neva. Chapter 3. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Delia led Diane through the forest, walking a step behind him just in case her assessment was wrong. Diane didn't find this to be too vexing. It would be more suspicious if she wasn't cautious of him. So, are you going to tell me what's so special about the lake? Diane looked back down toward Delia, who had her eyes focus on the trail in front of them. Considering you couldn't immediately tell, you wouldn't understand even if I told you. Try me. Diane smirked. It had been a long time since he hadn't understood something. On the off chance that he really didn't, it would only fuel his curiosity. Delia looked up at Diane and shook her head. In her eyes, he was a cocky boy who was a little too flirtatious. If he knew who her father was, or how easily she could kill him, he wouldn't be so casual. Simply put, everything in the universe has a will. The will of a lake is to be calm and serene. If you're swimming through it, you're obviously going against its will, so it will just as obviously fight back. Diane gave her a blank look before closing his eyes. To Delia, this was an obvious sign she was correct. He didn't understand. Just as she was about to tell him to forget it, Diane opened his eyes. Interesting. He looked away. Delia shook her head. Who is he trying to fool? I came to this school on the request of my mother. All she told me was that it was a completely different world with a new branch of science to explore. This will you mentioned must have something to do with what my mother spoke about. Diane's eyes seemed to glaze over as he continued down the path. Delia found this to be a bit mysterious. If he was from a commoner's family, there's no way his mother could know anything tangible about the martial world. However, calling what they practiced a new form of science would be exactly how any commoner would describe it. Although, in Delia's opinion, it would be more accurate to call it the oldest form of science. As if hearing Delia's thoughts, Diane spoke again. You probably think of it as the oldest form of science, right? Judging by how you describe the lake, everything must have a will. Assuming this to be true, that would go right up to the expanse of the universe. Which probably means that if the will of the lake is so tangible, it can be said the most tangible will is the universe itself. Delia's eyes widened before she settled into a smile. Maybe he's smarter than I gave him credit for. He's still a little incorrect though, maybe I'll help him out this time. Before she could speak, Diane continued. But, I've been to and swam in many lakes and I've never felt like that before. Which means it has something to do with your world specifically. Diane paused, which means one of two things. Either this is some sort of supreme lake that all other lakes bow to. Or, the true supreme power is found in the practitioners in your martial world, where you exert your will to manipulate other wills found in the world. To deduce that from a couple sentences. It seems like he doesn't need my help after all. You seem quite capable. So, you should now understand why I don't believe you crossed the lake yourself. Not to even mention that you supposedly did it in 5 days. Diane gave her a mysterious smile. Maybe my will is more supreme than the lake's. Or that technology on your wrist is. Delia said defiantly. To cross the lake in such a short time without the help of a device like the silver yacht, for example, is impossible. It would take a ridiculously high level of innate talent. However, according to the test he passed to come here, he was just barely average. On top of this, considering he just gained the most basic of understanding of the martial world, his innate talent would have to be even higher to compensate for his lack of understanding of how to counter the lake. Diane looked down at his wrists and smiled. Have you never seen these before? Interesting. Delia understood immediately what his words implied. She didn't understand their function, so therefore her guess had been incorrect. He must be bluffing. Diane flicked his wrist and pulled out a steaming brown bag of burritos before looking at Delia. Want one? No thank you. That isn't what an athlete should be eating. She shook her head firmly. Suit yourself. Diane began eating. Delia's eyes widened again. How can he eat so much and still be so fit? Diane must have finished 5-foot-long burritos in their half-an-hour walk to the center of the forest. This wouldn't have been so surprising if they hadn't also been the width of his arms. Diane flicked his wrists again and selected a white pearl before popping it into his mouth. He held it there as they approached a large tree before swallowing it. Delia looked at him confused. You swallowed a pearl. I can see you're a glutton, but for inanimate objects too. Diane chuckled. I love a beautiful lady with a sense of humor. That was a cleaning pearl. I can't very well go to such an important event with bad breath. Delia looked away to a hidden control panel on the large tree, ignoring his comment. Diane looked amused at her reaction before his eyes focused. They have the technology to build such a high-tech elevator within a tree, to sustain underwater architecture, and to overcome the will of a lake with a yacht, yet they don't know anything about storage bans and cleaning pearls. How odd. Do you know how much time we have until the ceremony? In fact, are you attending? Diane asked as they stepped into the tree. The tube fit the mood of the skyscrapers and risings. The ceiling and floor were fitted with miniature hexagonal tiling. Fitted in between them was a glass cylinder with yet another control panel built into it. The ceremony won't begin until tonight. I am also about to attend my first year here, so I will also be participating. Delia paused as though she was deciding whether or not it was right for her to continue. But, in the end, she sighed. I'm not sure if you're aware, so I'll let you know that this opening ceremony is taken quite seriously by the 6 pillar families of this school. Usually, only chosen among those 6 families can participate, not even sub-families can have their children perform. The fact that you've been allowed is a gesture of good faith to the human world. I hope you don't embarrass yourself with your antics. Diane looked at her calmly before replying. Perform. What are you talking about? Delia looked stunned. You don't even know that you're meant to display your talents at the opening ceremony. This is supposed to be an opportunity to entice mentors and by extension resources from the school. Delia shook her head in pity. He's already behind in resources because his family isn't of the martial world. If he doesn't perform well, hasn't he already lost? Interesting. So, this is how your martial world works. I guess it's not too far off from the real world. The elite display their talents while the poor never get the chance. Diane didn't show much of a reaction. If only your chosen are usually allowed to participate, then how do those from sub-families get backing? Delia looked at him. That's his first thought. Members of sub-families join the factions of the Chosen and gain resources by proxy. Diane nodded but didn't say anything else. Delia refrained from speaking as well. There was no point. Even if he had come prepared with something, it would have been meaningless. If he hadn't met Delia, he wouldn't even have the most basic of understanding of the martial world. To now be expected to wow experts was too much. That's probably why the families agreed to allow him to perform in the first place. He's going to embarrass himself. Diane was deep in thought before he looked up with wide eyes. The elevator had come out of the metallic tunnel it was following to reveal the expanse of the underwater skyscraper. The building was filled with students ranging from his age to about 20. The blue lake layered the building with a constant light blue hue that gave the building a calm feeling. But what really caught his eye was the massive wall of books. Even as the elevator continued down, a continuous wall of books was seen off to Diane's right. That must be a library that spans through multiple floors. Diane guessed. We have a few hours, right? I'd like to visit that library. Is it possible? You haven't received your identification materials yet, but I can lend you one of mine. You'll have to return it to me at the ceremony. Delia wouldn't usually do this, but she felt bad about what was about to happen to Diane. She understood the people who seemed the strongest on the outside, were often the weakest in the face of true trials. I hope this helps. She thought, hiding the emotion in her eyes. You're quite nice for a noble woman. Diane said, smiling down at her. I'll return the favor when I can. The sadness in her eyes hadn't escaped Diane's gaze. Regardless of his intelligence, it was impossible to tell what the root of the problem was. But he was keenly aware that he was being pitted. Considering her response when I asked about the lake, this will she spoke of is not something that's easy to understand. Yet, the fact this opening ceremony is meant to judge the chosen of this generation means this understanding of will is without a doubt of utmost importance. I have about 12 hours until the ceremony begins. Interesting. Wanting to make a fool out of me, huh? Diane's gaze flickered, a smoldering volcano laying dormant within their depths. Chapter 4 You are listening at novelfull.audio. Delia and Diane stepped out and into the lowest level of the underwater skyscraper. This library is massive. It spans the entire right side of this structure. 1,000 meters worth of books. That's wild. Diane looked up in awe. This library is actually just one of 6. Each of the 6 pillars has an entire half dedicated to one. That's in addition to the main library in the center pillar. Although, that one is much smaller. Delia spoke as if understanding Diane's intrigue. Having used a special entrance within the elevator, they stood in front of a desk much too grand to just be a reception desk. A light and airy, yet masculine voice rang out. Delia. It's nice to see you. And who's this friend of yours? Walking around with boys already, HM. I'm not sure what the head would think about that. Diane looked away from the massive desk and endless books to see a computer screen looking back at him. Within it was a well-dressed scrawny man with crystal-framed glasses. His golden eyes shone with an unconcealed humor in light of his teasing. She's actually already seen me naked. She's quite the wild one. Diane beamed at the monitor. Oh my. You're quite fearless. I like you. My name is Libro. It's rare to find someone willing to tease Delia. Libro chuckled. Delia brought her sword hilt to Diane's side, causing him to almost keel over. This is the strength of a 16-year-old girl. Diane looked over at her, but she was already pretending like nothing had happened. Diane involuntarily coughed before introducing himself. I'm Diane, it's nice to meet you. Before they could continue their bromance, Delia cut them off. I'm here as a favor to this one. I'm letting him use my identification card for a few hours. She handed the card to Diane. With that, she turned to leave. I'm looking forward to seeing you again, Diane said while watching her receding figure. Delia continued on, pretending like she hadn't heard him speak. As the elevator doors were closing, Delia spoke again. The ceremony is being held in the center pillar. Ask Libro how to get there. What an interesting beauty. I wonder if there are any more like her here. Diane smiled. So, Libro, I have a few questions for you, Diane said while turning back to the monitor. In fact, could I bother you to give me a quick summary of what this library provides? Libro smiled. You must be the commoner I've heard so much about. They said you ran away, but it looks like that was wrong. You can't have been hanging out with the young mistress this whole time, right? Diane grinned. A man can't kiss and tell, now can he? Libro's airy laughter seemed to fill the library, causing the students that had been drifting around to look over before shaking their heads and going back to what they were doing. It seems they were used to Libro's personality. Seems like that beauty has quite the high position here. Despite his casual appearance, Diane continued to analyze everything he could. This library, as you probably saw, is split into 100 levels for a total of 600 among the outer pillars. I'm responsible for all levels, which is why I sit behind this computer screen. Diane's eyes widened. In charge of 600 levels by yourself. Even with monitors that would be impossible, the levels you're able to access depend on your identification card. Since the young mistress gave you hers, you have access to all 600 outer levels. But, even she doesn't have access to the inner levels yet. A first-year student with almost unlimited access. If I'm right, her father must be head of one of the pillar families. Paisha, Neva, she said, though you have Delia's access for now, you most likely won't in the future. Usual first-year students have access to the first 10 levels at the most, but even that's in rare cases. Most are usually stuck at the minimum 1 level. How do you increase the levels you have access to? You can do it by performing well at the opening ceremony. Although that's usually reserved for pillar family chosen, I hear they've made an exception for you. In addition, you can be promoted through grades by passing your end-of-year exams. You can participate in challenges and tournaments throughout the year. There's also the possibility of ranking well in the numerous leaderboards, and doing well in a faction you create or join. Factions again. Diane couldn't hold back his smile. These next few years were going to be fun. Although it's the goal of most branch family students to gain access to higher levels in the outer pillars, the true treasure is within the inner pillar. There are no rules for how to gain access to it, just be outstanding. Just be outstanding. You don't have to tell me twice. Now, what were your questions? I have a theory about this will your martial world harps on. Diane spoke thoughtfully, allowing his eyes to lose their focus. Will. Ah, I understand. Delia must have dumbed it down for him. If your world is proficient at manipulating these wills, then it stands to reason that your creations would hold them too, correct? Libro let a small smile creep onto his lips. That would indeed be an accurate deduction. So, your books would hold them. So, if I decided to understand the will of the book instead of reading it, my understanding would probably be far deeper and I might even save some time. Libro was shocked. I'm not sure a beginner like you would be able to do something like that. That's a speed reading technique that does indeed exist, but it requires at least a basic understanding of martial theory and a powerful soul. Considering your explanation, you may have accurately stepped through into an initial understanding, but that's all it is. You'll need a much deeper understanding to even attempt to understand the technique. Diane only smiled. I'd like a book on this speed reading technique, the most basic books you have on martial world theory, as well as a rule and culture book for this school and society. Also, if you have a book of the current factions in this school, I'd appreciate that as well. Libro curtly nodded. His job was to help students find the books they needed and guide them through when they were lost. It seemed that Diane was set on this path and the choices of books he made were decent enough. As Libro fiddled with something on his side of the screen to track down the books Diane asked for, Diane continued to look around. This truly was the first time he'd seen such a grand library. It wouldn't even be fair to compare this to that library. Diane thought, taking in a deep breath. On either side of the elevator door was an expanse of glass going from one side of the building to the next. Diane noticed small cuts which he recognized as other doorways once he watched a student step through one. He nodded to himself. It made sense for there to be more entrances than just the one elevator. The desk in front of him seemed more like a display of wealth than anything else. It was made in ancient wood that breathed an air of nature into the already book-like smell of the library. The carvings on it swirled and dipped into a fantastic pattern. Diane almost couldn't resist touching it. I wonder what the other side of the building holds. Libro looked up and, in a display of what Diane assumed was his view of grandeur, slammed a final button that opened up a chasm in the large desk. 14 books flew up and out at Diane as he scrambled to catch them. "You're pretty sinister," Diane said while laughing and catching the last book. "How else would I have fun all day? This control room isn't exactly comfy," Libro said with a mysterious smile. Diane was once again given another shock while looking down at the books. They were all written by the same person. "Ah, the Sapientia family," Libro said in reminiscence. "I still remember the day I earned my crystal glasses." "So, it's a family. They own the monopoly on information. If only the books on martial theory were written by them, it'd be one thing. But the rule book, the culture book, the speed reading technique, and the book of factions too. That's utter nonsense. No one sees an issue with this. The Sapientia family is actually one of the few families with multiple main branches. We're basically responsible for all research and development in the martial world for this universe. If you want to become a researcher, you join the family. If you're good enough, you become part of a main branch. Not many other families even think about giving that chance." Libro sighed in pride. "It can't possibly be that no one who's ever made a discovery has chosen not to join the family, right?" Diane was confused. This one family can't have written every book for the martial world. "Well, the Sapientia family is the leading expert. Meaning, any new book that will be published must pass through a subsidiary branch at a minimum. The higher the ranking of the Sapientia branch that approves it, the more reliable, rare, and sought after the book is. Every book will say Sapientia on the cover, but you can find the true writer on the inside. The only exception would be techniques. But obviously, speed reading is a technique that would be highly beneficial to a researching family, so it's not a surprise that it was created by us as well." Diane nodded. He found this world fascinating. To have a single family monopolize information would cause an outcry in his world, but it was perfectly normal here. "Thank you for your help, Libro," Diane said sincerely as he walked to the end of the desk and passed it to look for a place to read. Libro shut off the monitor and switched his view to the cameras of the base floor library. He was interested in seeing how Diane would approach this and if he could really understand in the short time he had left. If he reads the speed reading book first in overeagerness, he'll end up wasting all 12 hours he has left trying to understand. Let's see if he makes the right choice. Diane walked through one of the main aisles of books and ladders to find a small pond, flowing with odd golden water. Ignoring the glances of curiosity from the surrounding students, he picked a meditation platform and sat down. The speed reading book requires a basic understanding of martial theory. So, it's clear that I'll have to read the basic books first. Even if it takes most of the time I have left, I'll have to finish at least 2 before reading the speed reading book and trying to finish the last ones. Libro smiled as he watched Diane pick up the basics of martial theory book. Delia sure knows how to pick M. Delia would probably hit him in the side with her sword too if she had heard that thought. Libro chuckled to himself and watched the future bloom right in front of him. Chapter 5. You are listening at novelfull.audio. In the lowest level of the center pillar laid a massive room of ceremony. Carpets of lavender and crimson bathed the floor, almost fighting against the blue hues that washed in from the surrounding lake. The grand room was the only level of the center pillar and skyscraper that was submerged underwater and had a ceiling of at least 30 meters in height. Strong and sturdy silver pillars carved with intricate patterns followed the room's circular shape. Pillar after pillar gave the room a dominating feel that was only interrupted by the gaps allowed for the 6 entrances that connected the outer pillars. The designs of the silver pillars seemed to hold up the ceiling by merging with it, continuing the captivating carvings to lead to a massive chandelier. Many circular tables filled the grand room, bathed in cloths that matched the carpet's blood-red design. Elaborate floral decorations and candles graced the centers of these tables, displaying never-ending wealth. At the end of this room laid a wide set of stairs that led to 6 thrones. Familiar faces that had graced the silver yacht sat there, once again feigning politeness. The beautiful dark-skinned Duco spoke. "Paisha, Neva, your daughter has grown to be quite beautiful." A strong and stoic man sat on one of the 2 center thrones. His skin had a deep olive color that seemed to complement Delia's. His eyes glowed a murky brown that was worn with age. His beard was marvelous, flowing a deep brown that was accented with whites. His hair was of medium length, combed over and well kept. Just like the other family head, he wore robes fitting of their stature. A flowing red robe with a chain of gold that held the symbol of focus, F, at its middle. He smiled. "Indeed she has. I hear Pharaoh has grown to be quite dependable. The Duco family will have good times ahead." Duco smiled, appreciating the compliment but being inwardly surprised. She had gone through quite a few measures to keep Pharaoh's potential hidden, but it seemed that the head of the Paisha, Neva family had seen through her. A tall and sharp Asian man, whose face still contained his youthful vigor, walked up to the nobles before placing himself on the last throne beside Paisha, Neva. He nodded in greeting before closing his eyes and preparing for the ceremony to begin. The shorter Asian man glanced at him before turning away. "It seems the Kami family head has come. Now that we're all here, we can begin." "Correct, headmaster." Delia's father nodded in agreement. His eyes scanned the room as if looking for something before landing on his daughter who sat at a table with the other chosen of the pillar families. Delia gave him a pointed look that conveyed her message. Delia's father understood. "I guess he's not coming," he said in a soft voice. "No matter." He stood and the pressure in the room seemed to increase immensely. Everyone stopped what they were doing and silence reigned. The soft swaying of the ceiling's chandelier made the room's only sound, filling the room with a faint twinkling sound. Despite being the best teachers Focus Academy had to offer, they didn't dare breath a word when the headmaster spoke. "Today, we've gathered in honor of the opening of a new year at our Focus Academy. As is customary, the chosen of our families will display their talents for us today to showcase their level of understanding of martial theory." He turned to look at the table of youths, sparing a quick glance at the empty seat. "I'm sure you all understand the importance of this event. You only get one chance, and in many ways, it will decide your path for at least the next 10 years. Stay resolute. Be confident. Display your focus. We will all bear witness to the level of will you can display." A towering teen who was almost an exact replica of the towering man from the yacht stood, his blue eyes flashing with a competitive light. "It would be an honor if you would allow me to go first, headmaster." The teen clasped his hands and bowed. Paisha, Neva nodded before returning to his throne. The tables, chairs and people were picked up by some unknown force and guided to the edges of the room. You would be hard-pressed to tell what was happening if you had your eyes closed. However, those well-trained eyes could tell that this was related to a formation created by someone skilled in the soul path. A platform raised itself about 3 feet in the center of the now open space, allowing the tall boy to stride forward with confidence, and hop onto it. Spear. The boy shouted in a voice much deeper than what it should have been for his age. A black carbon spear began to materialize, its tip shining with a silver sharpness as lightning crackled along its handle. The nobles nodded in appreciation. He's able to call upon the elements. Although faint, this is proof of at least a basic understanding of the will of lightning, at least the first of the 9 levels. Something that was commendable for such a youth. A mentor of Focus Academy chortled, stroking his beard. This would have been impressive enough to gain quite a few sponsors, but family head Storm's smile only grew larger. Clouds began to materialize as the youth spun his spear. He moved swiftly, with an agility that shouldn't be possible with his size. The crackles of lightning within the dark clouds grew more and more pronounced until the youth reached the apex of his movements. Ha! The boy roared. A thick bolt of lightning descended onto the platform, falling directly onto the tip of the sword as the youth swept his spear for the final time. Headmaster Pasha, Neva quickly waved his hand, forming a barrier around the platform. The barrier rippled and distorted as the youth stabbed forward, but remained firm in the end. Sweat rolled down the youth's brow, but a proud smile bloomed on his immature features. I am Hawk Storm. Remember my name. The barrier dematerialized as Hawk stepped off the platform. A booming laughter filled the room. Ha! Well done, son. Chapter 6. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The nobles were stunned. That technique was at least at the small success level of a common grade technique. Hawk was at the 2nd or even 3rd year level, a genius indeed. A 16-year-old at such an advanced level. You've raised quite the successor, Storm. Family head by chuckled. Storm beamed, looking off at his son proudly. A fair-skinned Asian girl stood after Hawk took his seat. She strode forward with elegant steps, her features beautiful and her demeanor domineering. The room seemed to be washed with a white light that flowed from the young lady's flowing sundress. She stood even shorter than Delia, and her eyes shone a violet that was only more pronounced because of her swaying jet-black hair. A translucent compass lit her feet as she used it to float onto the stage. The nobles received their second shock of the night, and it was Bai's turn to smile this time. The feng shui compass, Bai. Where have you been hiding this gem? Duko spoke out, her silver eyes shining to disbelief. The compass beneath the beautiful girl's feet grew in size to perfectly fit the elevated platform before she bowed. My name is Bai Meiying, I look forward to the coming years, she said in a sweet voice. Her compass shrunk and guided her back to her seat where she sat still smiling. Although an understanding of the elements is considered great within the martial world, an understanding of something more abstract like the compass Meiying used supersedes its difficulty by several folds. This is because, although will is abundant, it is also limited. Elements are easier to understand because their existence is infinite and supported by the will of everything. However, a feng shui compass has limited will supporting it because it is a practice only seen in a small portion of the world. For a child as young as Meiying to carve out a place for herself in the will of the feng shui compass was unheard of. To be competing for the will of the compass against experts well beyond her years. And to be able to expand it as far as she did. She is without a doubt a future pillar of our alliance. Storm spoke in disbelief. He had been confident that his son would be most impressive, but it seemed that he had counted on too much. The youths came up one after another, displaying talents far beyond their years. Pharaoh Duko displayed his shape-shifting ability. His will of the eagle, wolf and bear shook all in attendance. To understand not one, but 3 wills at such a young age was simply outrageous. Kami Mayumi was equally as impressive. His unceasingly calm demeanor as he pulled on his bow and arrow was unmatched through at least 4th years. A chill filled the room as he pierced target after target. Even his cold father opened his eyes and gave him a curt nod before Mayumi returned to his seat. L.RG afterwards, a small boy with black framed glasses walked to the stage. He was meek and frail, but his golden eyes shone with a keen intelligence. Calligraphy. He called out in a soft shout. A kneeling table materialized along with a rolled piece of thick paper and a glass container of ink with an elegant brush leaning within it. The boy kneeled and set himself. In the next moment, his meekness disappeared. His eyes grew sharp as he opened the paper and lifted the brush in one swift motion. The nobles held their breath, all think the same thing, the will of words. The boy began writing with strokes as sharp as his eyes. His brow furrowed as he leaned in with the utmost concentration. A soft wind seemed to sweep the room as he finished his final swipe of the brush. My name is Pertinacis Sapientia. Today I give you this word. Genius. How bold. A mentor responsible for caring for the inner libraries took a keen interest in Pertinacis. The ceremonial hall washed over in a radiant light as Pertinacis turned over his work for show. In that instant, everyone felt the will of his word. The overbearing pursuit of knowledge and the perseverance to achieve the ultimate goal. Truly genius. To convey emotion and by extension change the will of those around you is something even 5th and 6th year students of Focus Academy can't do. Mayumi reached this realm partially by washing us over with his cold intent. But, Pertinacis has his feet firmly planted in this realm. Truly astounding. The headmaster spoke his words of appreciation. The handsome man who wore the crystal-framed glasses smiled at his son as Pertinacis walked off the stage. Pertinacis walked to the steps at the end of the hall before respectfully bowing and continuing. He handed the paper to his father before heading back to his seat. Well done. Family head Sapientia spoke softly. Delia broke out of her concentration to stand once Pertinacis sat. Brown-gold hair flowing, her eyes sharpened. She wore a beautiful black skirt that had layered folds. Her black stockings were stretched by her toned legs and ended in black flats. The neck of her pale pink blouse wrapped around her shoulders lower than usual, revealing the silver necklace that graced her collarbone. A sword materialized in her hand as ice petals blossomed from her feet. Her pale green eyes iced over into a cold blue. Unlike others, she had no need to call upon the creation formation. The only nobles that remained seated were Camille and Paisha, Neva, but even Camille's usual calm demeanor was blown over as his eyes snapped open. Duco sucked in a breath. The will of ice manifested changes within her, the nobles were stunned. Although Pharaoh had called upon the will of the eagle, bear and wolf, the changes were only illusory. The eagle, for example, partially increased his eyesight and agility, the bear his strength, and the wolf his instincts and speed. But Delia was becoming a whole new person. Her hair instantly turned into a bright white. Her skin paled, becoming even fairer than Mei Ying's. Her body shone a bright light before bursting out within her. A layer of frost covered the whole of the ceremony hall. A wall of ice emanated outward as she lightly swung her sword, causing fierce ripples within the barrier. Delia finally closed her eyes, lowering herself to the ground. The cold wind subsided, reducing the chill of the guests in the hall. Her hair returned to its usual golden brown and her eyes warmed to its usual pale green and hazel color. Her sword disappeared as she returned to her seat. Hawk was the first to compliment her. You're amazing, Delia. And here I thought I was going to be the best. Admiration, jealousy, and attraction colored his blue eyes. Mei Ying grabbed Delia's arm and pulled her closer. Stay away, Hawk, I can smell your breath from over here. Delia smiled warmly and looked up at her father, who gave her a nod of approval. I'm confused though, why are there 7 seats here? Mei Ying whispered into Delia's ear. A complicated expression flashed on Delia's full features before they were interrupted by the whooshing of 1-6 doors opening. Clapping resounded from the door. Dian stood with his hands clasped together, clearly dressed much too informally. His dress shirt flowed behind him and his crisp white shirt clung to his lean torso as he strolled into the room towards Delia's table without a care in the world. His voice sounded through the quiet hall. I didn't open the door earlier because I didn't want to interrupt such a spectacular performance. Why didn't you tell me you could get even more beautiful? Diane stopped in front of Delia and Mei Ying before he grabbed Delia's hand and placed her identity card within it. Diane let go as his eyes flashed with interest when he looked over at the beautiful Asian girl holding on to Delia. Wow, you have beautiful friends too. Diane's laughter filled the hall as if oblivious to the pressure that was building on the stage behind him. Back in the control room, Libro shook his head. A monster, simply a monster. Chapter 7. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Diane pulled the empty chair between his legs and leaned his chest on the backrest, sitting behind the two girls. What's your name? Diane asked with a smile, not hiding his roaming gaze. Mei Ying shot a glance at her fuming father before smiling mischievously. By Mei Ying. She responded in a sweet voice. Ah, a beautiful name for a beautiful girl. I believe that means beautiful flower, correct? How fitting. Mei Ying seemed to be surprised that Diane knew the meaning of her name, but instead of saying anything she raised an eyebrow towards Delia, who was pretending to not notice what he was doing. You know, you might die. Delia said. Worried. About me. I'm touched. Diane said, shifting his attention away from Mei Ying. Who do you think you are? Hawk bellowed. Diane didn't even spare Hawk a glance. Your card was very useful. Thank you. I gained quite a bit of knowledge. Delia nodded in acknowledgement, then chose to close her eyes. This guy really is shameless. He's going to get himself killed. Hawk was about to stand in rage when Mayumi gripped his shoulder. What's the use of getting riled up, Hawk? He looked towards Diane before continuing. Our pillar families, by the goodness of our hearts, have decided to grace you with a seat amongst us chosen. Don't you think disrupting the proceedings like this is disrespectful? Couldn't have said it better myself. Hawk said, sitting down and crossing his arms like a petulant child. So Mei Ying, how long have you and Delia been friends? She's a bit cold and I could use some help. Diane said while turning his attention back to the beautiful Mei Ying. Mei Ying brought her free hand to her lips and giggled. This guy sure is interesting. I wonder how long it'll be before Dad kills him. It's been so long, yet even I don't know whether she's interested in boys. Mei Ying said teasingly. No wonder. Diane said while comically bringing his fist to his palm. I had begun to wonder whether I wasn't handsome enough. Noel, then the pressure in the room was palpable. Mei Ying released Delia, hunching over in a laughter. Delia was still pretending to not hear anything, but her face was at least half a shade redder. He really said that, and in front of my father too. Delia thought in a rage. She took a slow breath trying to calm herself and kept her eyes sealed. Mayumi and Hawk were fuming at having been ignored. Pharaoh had a smile on his face, and Pertinacis was reading words that flew by on the lenses of his glasses. Diane finally looked up to the 6 thrones. His eyes glittering when he saw the beautiful dark-skinned family head, something Pharaoh found much less amusing. Duco chuckled. This boy seems to have his eyes set quite high. Cammy had long since reopened his eyes, a sinister aura swirling around him. Sapientia, much like his son, had stopped paying attention. However, the same could not be said of the Pasha, Neva, Storm and By family heads. The room's guests had begun to struggle to breathe. Everyone was wondering the same thing. Who is this boy, and how has he not long since burst from the pressure? Diane finally spoke. You 4 seem like you're about to pop a blood vessel. That can't be good at your age. If things continue like this, we could have a messy situation on our hands. What a scandal it would be. 6 elders kill child. How domineering of you. Sapientia finally looked up in shock. The eyes of the rest of the family heads widened. Who do you, By tried to speak before being cut off. Let me stop you right there. That musclehead over there tried to ask the same thing, Diane said, nudging his head towards Hawk, and clearly I ignored him, so why would you try to ask again? The room was astonished. These were grandmasters of the highest level. They hadn't been disrespected in years, and yet this unknown kid had said words they couldn't even imagine thinking. Mei Ying finally stopped laughing. Her usual carefree yet domineering demeanor had been blown over into full-on shock. But then she started laughing inwardly. Teach that old man a lesson before you die, then. Diane stood and began walking towards the steps. Unlike Pertinacis, he didn't bow, he instead continued straight up until he was about 5 meters from the thrones. He clasped his hands behind his back and said, "If you'd like to know who I am. Here, I guess I'm a commoner. But, on the other side of the world, I'm son to Saintess Sacharo and General Sacharo. Diane Sacharo at your service." He looked over at Duco before smiling. Sacharo is actually Latin for sugar, he said with a wink. The family heads almost flew out of their thrones. Only Duco and Sapientia looked on in curiosity. Mayumi had had enough. He stood from his chair and touched his earring. A bow and arrow materialized before he took aim for Diane. Just as he was about to lose his shot, Diane looked back at him. "Sit." A wild pressure filled the room, suffocating Mayumi and forcing him to cough up blood. Kami gripped the rest of his chair in uncontrolled anger. The throne disintegrated, leaving him standing. He was about to make strides towards Diane, when he was stopped by Paisha, Neva. In the end, he could only grit his teeth and rematerialize a throne for him to sit on. Wow, this martial world sure is interesting. I can't believe that worked. A supposed chosen with a weaker soul than a commoner. How fascinating. Delia had opened her eyes to see Mayumi keeling over, taking ragged breaths with his bow and arrow long since dropped from his hands. Now, honestly speaking, I'm quite unrefined. That was simply a parlor trick. Any of the 6 of you could kill me, Diane said, looking back at the family heads. Chapter 8. You are listening at novelfull.audio. In fact, if that idiot with the bow gets up, he could probably kill me too. However, both you and I know quite well why it is you can't kill me, no. If it wasn't for that, would you lofty so-called nobles try such underhanded tricks more befitting a commoner like me? Diane turned and walked off to the center stage. Since none of you truly know me, I'll tell you a little about myself. My name is Diane, like I said. I happen to be 16 and I guess you could say I possess a little intelligence. I love long walks, but not on beaches because sand can get quite annoying. I'm what you all would probably call a commoner. Maybe a couple centuries ago I'd be more reserved, but fortunately, from what I understand, this small school doesn't have the ability to fight against us commoners at the moment. Small school. Rage was filled the room. What are you all getting mad about? If that's all it took for you to get mad, you should have probably fought back long ago. I wonder what the point of funding a school made for elites by elites. They may as well have just used their resources to homeschool their kids. Diane had reached the center of the stage. He stood, looking off into the crowd. The rage was almost immediately calmed. But, unfortunately, I'm not in the habit of helping people who can't help themselves. So instead of wasting my time, I'll just show you what happens when a commoner gets to perform. Those guys sucked anyway. Except for you two, of course. He said, smiling at Delia and Mei Ying, who still hadn't recovered from what was transpiring. L.RG, let's see, from what I read, anything I'd like to display my talents with should manifest itself, correct? Then let's go with this, piano. Diane spoke softly. A pearly white grand piano began to manifest in front of him as Diane walked toward its bench. Today, I do this because a few people tried to disrespect me. The moment he sat, a wave of light surged through the room, sending a light breeze through the air. Remember my name and who I am. Do not provoke me, and you will not be provoked. This pressure, he hasn't even started playing yet. He shouldn't have any knowledge of how to call upon wills, how is he doing this? Delia was more surprised than anyone. Only she knew the extent his knowledge had reached just a few hours ago. To already have the ability to injure Mayumi and emit the will of music without even playing, it was unprecedented. Diane's eyes sharpened as he raised his hands to the marble keys. The pressure in the room multiplied several folds. The light that had been emitted rushed back towards Diane and merged with him just as he pressed down on the first note. Diane's fingers raced across the keys as a sweet melody rang out. He unleashed his frustration, his pain and his sadness. He closed his eyes. Sensing the smell his mother's cooking, feeling her arms around him, hearing her voice ringing out. He could feel his father's bitter training and hear his strict voice. The pressure increased as Diane's fingers forcefully slammed the keys, almost as if to beat the piano into submission. His heart beat faster and faster as he tightened the lids of his eyes to escape from the tears. He heard his father's robust laugh, felt his sturdy shoulders carry him, saw the purity in his brown eyes. Diane thought of the anger he felt. How dare they? This was their last request and you want to run me out of here. The tune immediately changed, multiplying in ferocity. The floors began to rumble and the silver pillars began to shake. Diane slammed his foot down on the rightmost pedal of the piano, layering note after note, chord after chord. The glass windows of the ceremony hall cracked, but Diane didn't stop. No one could move, the captivation of the melody was too much. Pasha, Neva waved his hand, trying to use the same barrier he had before to contain Diane. But, it immediately shattered. You want to contain me? The music amplified. People in the hall began to forget if they'd ever heard music before. They tried as hard as they could but the only melody that filled their minds took the shape of Diane's rage. The glass windows cracked again. He's gaining a monopoly on the will of music. This is ridiculous. Cammy thought. Pasha, we have to stop him. Bai spoke in anger. No, let him have his temper tantrum. We were in the wrong. We'll stop it if it goes too far. Although the family heads mostly held faces of anger, all of them were truly astonished. They had never felt this type of pressure before from a mere child. Delia stood, walking towards Diane. The pressure not affecting her. She was a bit annoyed to see the same was the case for every other female in the room, but she chalked it up to Diane's shameless attitude. But, she couldn't hide were the tears on her face. She didn't know what made Diane so sad and so angry, but she knew that someone should stop him. So, she reached out and placed her hand on his shoulder. Diane stopped playing and opened his reddened eyes. He looked up at Delia who had tears streaking down her face. He stood immediately and wiped the tears from her cheeks with his thumb. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to make you cry. My mom would kill me if she knew about this. Delia didn't say anything, so Diane let her walk back to her seat. Diane looked around the room. It seemed most of the people in the hall had streaks of tears on their face or were fighting to hold them back. Diane's ferocity and sadness disappeared in an instant, replaced by his usual carefree and flirtatious attitude. Then he turned and left, leaving only one thought in everyone's mind. How domineering. Chapter 9 You are listening at novelfull.audio. Diane walked along a moving floor, heading back to the same pillar he had met Libro in, Pasha, Neva pillar. Looking down at the white card in his hand, he sighed. After all that, it seems like I'll be stuck with books on just the first level. He smirked. Delia's never going to fall for me if I have to ask her for help at every turn. Thinking back to Mei Ying, Diane chuckled. She's definitely not simple either. I felt like I was almost being used, but what complaints would I ever have about such a pretty little lady needing my services? Diane's eyes flashed with seriousness. He knew he needed an action plan. For one, the currency system in this martial world was entirely different. Diane was so poor here that he couldn't even afford a ride on the silver yacht. Secondly, there's the matter of access. Being restricted to just the first level wasn't a big deal for now, but considering Diane's speed reading ability, he knew he'd finish the entire first level in about 2 months at the most, and that was if he read things useless to him. Plus, that wasn't accounting for the increase his speed would undergo as he further familiarized himself with the technique. Diane shook his head. These people are so petty. By my performance, I definitely deserve higher floor access. But considering their anger, being frozen out might be the best possible outcome. I'll have to publicize my future accomplishments so that they have no choice but to follow the rules in the future. Diane's eyes glazed over in thought. In truth, he had many ideas, but they needed time to be implemented. With just 1 week before classes started, Diane didn't have much time before his freedom was cut down by almost half. This money thing is going to be an issue, although Diane had his wristbands to preserve the food he brought from home. Considering how much he ate, that would last another 2 weeks at the most. After that, he'd need money to eat. And that's not even speaking on how he would protect himself. Of course, the main way students protected themselves were factions. But, with Diane's pride, he had no intention of asking Delia to join hers. Even if she asked him, his answer would be no. To these people, his arrogance was bordering on stupid. To them, he had a pride he hadn't earned. But, only he knew what he had been through in his life. He'd crush them in their own field without relying on anyone else. That said, this didn't mean that Diane didn't have avenues to explore. In addition to student-led factions headed by the Chosen and Pseudo-Chosen, there were so-called secondary profession factions that caught his eye. Usually, students who joined these factions had niche abilities that chosen factions would seek out. The best factions could permanently employ those of secondary profession factions. From the books Diane read, the library was considered one. But, he immediately crossed it off his list. Unfortunately, he didn't do this willingly. According to faction rules, only those of the Sapientia family could become members. Also, it required having knowledge of the first 600 levels to be admitted. Unlike the student-formed factions, that were more free-form, pillar factions had strict rules and guidelines to be met, as well as their own internal ranking systems that provided higher-tier members with extra benefits. Of course, that isn't to say that student-run factions don't have their own admittance tests. They were just seen as generally easier. It was unfortunate that this route was barred to him because this faction provided the easiest path to the inner library. But, it couldn't be helped. The next were sports factions. But, as you might imagine, Diane had never heard of these sports before. If it was a simple matter of reading the rules, he would have considered it. However, Diane knew that these sports factions required understanding of the martial world he simply didn't have right now. It might have seemed like Diane magically became a genius of the martial world after just a few hours of reading, but this was a wholly false perception. Firstly, the shout that made Mayumi cough up blood was terrible double-edged sword. After a few hours of reading, Diane learned that his energy cultivation talent was absolutely terrible. However, he surprisingly had what was known as an innate soul. Normally, martial warriors needed to go through various steps to awaken their souls from slumber. Souls would then provide an excellent means of communicating with the heavens and comprehending wills. The problem was that souls were extremely fragile. If Mayumi had been prepared for Diane to do something so stupid as directly attack with his soul, the worst-case scenario would have been Diane's death. Simply put, the stupidity of Diane's actions was the only reason why he was standing right now. In addition, invoking the will of music was something simple for him. Diane had been playing the piano ever since he was tall enough to climb onto the bench that stood in front of his mother's favorite Steinway. The only reason that he didn't produce phenomena like today in the mortal world was because it was devoid of the energy the martial world had. But, it wasn't like Diane could carry around a piano where he went. And, he had no idea how to attack with it. he could only vaguely affect the emotions of those around him. This said, there was good news too. Although souls were terrible for combat, those talented in the soul path were the staples of secondary professions. Dian had no idea whether he was talented in the soul path or not. Simply having an innate soul wasn't enough of a marker. But, what Dian was certain of was that whether he was talented or not, he would grasp this chance. At the very least, he had a little more talent on the soul path than the energy path. There's the alchemy faction, the formation faction, the forging faction, the beast master faction, and the philosophy debate faction. Of those, although the idea of what creatures the martial world piqued Dian's interest, he had no way of knowing how long it would take to make significant contributions to a faction that required raising animals. For all he knew, it could take decades to raise a decent creature. And even then, he would have to give it away for him to garner any of the basic benefits he was looking for. At first, he had thought of the possibility of using beasts as a proxy for his strength, but the time needed was again a barrier, not to mention money. Chapter 10. You are listening at novelfull.audio. As for the philosophy debate faction, Dian once again had to push the idea away because he simply didn't know enough. It was clear that a faction of philosophy was important to a world based in understanding the wills of things, but without a clear understanding himself, even marginally contributing would be difficult. And the crux of the matter was that if he wanted to profit from joining, it would again take time to build up a reputation, so others would be willing to pay to listen to his lectures. The forging factions was quite a good choice, but it required high cultivation levels to improve at a steady pace. Without appropriate strength, it would be impossible to forge the materials of the martial world, or even handle the environment needed to mold said materials. At the moment, Dian couldn't even sense energies of the martial world. How would he gain enough strength to hammer those godly materials or handle the heat needed to smelt them? This left the alchemy and formation factions. However, Dian felt that there was something severely off-putting about them. It wasn't that anything about them in particular was odd, but rather the fact there existed a faction that combined the both of them. Why do the alchemy and formation factions exist if something like the array alchemy faction does? I don't get it. Dian's brows furrowed as he continued to walk. Plus, according to the Book of Factions, the alchemy and formation factions have dozens of members each, but the array alchemy faction only has 2. Although Dian was confused, he smelt the signs of opportunity. Due to the importance of secondary professions, Libro had warned Dian that they were arrogant and uppity. Maybe a small 2-person faction was exactly what Dian needed to get his feet wet. Still, the question remained. How could you combine formation theory with alchemy theory? Having made his choice, Dian spun on his heels. He could look for his room later, but now, it was more important to do more research. So, he headed back towards the library. Dian walked into the library to find it to be in the same state he left it in. It must have been almost midnight by now, but it seemed like the students hadn't noticed. Maybe there's some technique that also reduces the amount of sleep you need. Dian had previously thought that this might be a possibility, but since he was on a time crunch, he hadn't asked Libro. Standing in front of the grandiose desk, Dian waved at the monitor. It flickered to life to reveal Libro shaking his head. You're really reckless, you know. Had you misread the situation even a bit, you would be dead. Dian smiled a devious smile. So you have cameras in more areas than just the libraries. Dian shrugged. They wouldn't dare openly harm me unless they want war with the mortal world. A wry smile spread across Libro's lips. Maybe Focus Academy is wary of the mortal world, but the same can't be said for higher echelons of the martial world. You need to be careful. I'll keep that in mind. Dian was well aware of this fact. But, he was a person who adapted to the situation while following his principles. If this approach wouldn't have worked, he would have found another. I'm thinking of joining the Array Alchemy faction, so I need whatever books this first level card you gave me can get on them and their area of expertise. Libro's eyes flashed with something that looked like disappointment. You know, I could put in a good word for you and help you join the library and research faction. Also, the Array Alchemy faction is, a complicated look graced his features, taking over the disappointment. Thank you, Libro. Diane said sincerely. But I don't think I'd like to join the Sapientia family. Libro sighed. I understand. If you ever change your mind in the future, we're always looking for intelligent lads like you. Libro really was disappointed. He had just watched Diane learn a speed reading technique that only the top percentage of the Sapientia family knew. He had only given it to Diane to help Delia fulfill her favor and because he never thought he'd be able to learn it. Now, an elite technique of the Sapientia family was out in the world and the person who had it wasn't willing to join them. But Diane, there are other factions you could join. The Array Alchemy faction is dead in the water. Not to even mention the fact that since you only have access to the first floor, none of their advanced techniques aren't available to you. Even if you had Delia's card you would be at a loss. Focus Academy doesn't have a single advanced technique with connection to the Array Alchemy faction regardless of floor. Diane was sad to hear this, but he had no choice. Only a faction like this would, for one, accept him, and also have a low requirement for cultivation. He had limited options. I get it, I get it. Diane said softly. Although the fact the entire academy doesn't have any advanced techniques is surprising, I'll have to continue forward with them. The Array Alchemy faction had 2 members, one of which was barely at the lower common grade threshold, while the head barely touched upon the door of the high common grade. Considering the heads of the Alchemy and Formation factions had all broken into the practitioner grade, this showing was simply too pitiful. I won't deny that the theory behind Array Alchemy has supreme value. But, there's a reason that there's a taboo on combining alchemy and formation theory. They're too difficult to learn alone, let alone fusing them. Libro shook his head. Diane smiled. I can't begin my road in the martial world yet because I don't want to begin without the proper cultivation technique. And even if I had one, my talent in energy cultivation seems to be pitiful. But, Array Alchemy from the lower to peak common grade doesn't require my power being high. I only need an understanding of plants, array theory, a refined soul and plenty of practice drawing arrays and grafting plants together. I can do this. He looked at Libro, eyes burning with determination. Libro's eyes softened. I'll make an exception. Since even the so-called array alchemists of our school don't check out these books, I'll give you a copy of every array alchemy related book we have at Focus Academy. And, I'll toss in the alchemy and formation theory exclusive books for the first 10 floors. Diane smiled brightly, feeling very thankful to Libro. However, what he didn't know was that Libro was keeping a harsh reality secret from him. In the martial world, all 3 paths, energy, body and soul, were connected. Currently, Diane had an innate soul awakened, which made him lucky, but only insofar as a 1/5 probability was concerned. When all was said and done, Diane's soul was at the lower foundation stage. This meant he could practice array alchemy to the lower common grade. However, if he wanted to progress to the middle common grade, he needed a middle foundation stage soul. The body, energy, and the soul were all connected. If the body was not powerful enough, one could not house more powerful energy, nor a more powerful soul. Simply put, if Diane wanted to progress along the soul path, he had to either progress along the arduously difficult and ignored body path, or learn to leap over the hurdle of his poor talent and use the auxiliary ability of energy cultivation to temper his body. Either way, it was impossible to rely on the soul path alone. Yet, that was all he had. Bnol.m.